Chapter 35, Section 3, JFK's Record on Foreign Affairs. As president, Kennedy's greatest triumphs, but also his most disastrous mistakes, were in foreign affairs. U.S. relations with Cuba proved to be especially troublesome for the president. A crisis over Soviet missile sites in Cuba brought the United States and the Soviet Union to the brink of nuclear war. Fidel Castro establishes a communist regime in Cuba. In 1959, communist revolutionaries led by Fidel Castro had ousted Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista. As a result, the United States suddenly found that it had a communist regime or government for a neighbor, just 90 miles off the Florida coast. Once in power, Castro established strong ties with the Soviet Union. The USSR sent advisors, weapons, and financial aid to Cuba. With his Soviet help, Castro transformed Cuba into a communist country with a planned economy. Government planners began to make almost all economic decisions. The government took control of U.S. oil refineries and farms on the island and seized private businesses and properties from wealthy Cubans. Reluctant to live under a communist regime, many Cubans fled the island. Most of these exiles, or people who lived outside their home country, settled in southern Florida. Shortly after taking office, Kennedy learned that the CIA had begun training some of these Cuban exiles in Florida and Guatemala as guerrilla fighters. The clandestine mission of these exiles was to return to Cuba and lead a popular uprising that would topple Castro and his regime. The Bay of Pigs fiasco failed to dislodge Castro. The CIA officials who briefed Kennedy on the invasion plan assured the new president that the invasion would inspire Cubans to rise up and rebel against Castro. CIA Director Allen Dulles told Kennedy that if he wanted to stop Castro's growing influence in Latin America, the time to act was now or never. Eager to show he was a strong Cold War president, Kennedy allowed the plan to move forward. On April 17, 1961, a small army of Cuban exiles sailed into the Bay of Pigs in southern Cuba. The landing was a disaster. CIA trainers had told the exiles they would come ashore on an empty beach, but their boats ran aground on a coral reef. Once the exiles reached land, Cuban troops quickly killed or captured them. Meanwhile, the expected uprising never took place. A few officials tried to persuade Kennedy to send U.S. warplanes to back up the exiles, but Kennedy did not want to involve the United States further in this poorly executed fiasco. After the Bay of Pigs invasion, people throughout Latin America criticized Kennedy for interfering in another country's affairs. Shouldering the blame, Kennedy remarked, "Victory has 1,000 fathers, but defeat is an orphan." Escalating Cold War tensions in Berlin. In June 1961, not long after the Bay of Pigs disaster, Kennedy and Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev held a summit meeting in Vienna, Austria. Heads of state hold such meetings to discuss important topics. In Vienna, one of the topics discussed was the future of Berlin. Since the end of World War II, Berlin had been a divided city. East Berlin served as the capital of communist East Germany. West Berlin, although surrounded by East Germany, remained under the control of the wartime Allies. In time, the border between Eastern and Western Europe was closed everywhere except in Berlin. As a result, Berlin became the only escape route for people trapped behind the Iron Curtain. Hundreds of thousands of East Germans took advantage of this opening to flee their country. By 1961, approximately 25,000 East German refugees were crossing into West Berlin each day. At that rate, East Germany would soon lose much of its workforce. During the Vienna summit, Khrushchev warned Kennedy that he would not allow the flow of refugees into West Berlin to continue. Kennedy responded that he was prepared to defend West Berlin, even at the risk of war. At this point, Khrushchev decided that the only option left to East Germany was to wall itself off from West Berlin. On August 13, 1961, East German workers began building a barbed wire fence between East and West Berlin. Later, the government replaced the fence with tall concrete walls. The Berlin Wall made it all but impossible for East Germans to escape to freedom in West Berlin. The United States and other Western European nations reacted with outrage to the building of the Berlin Wall. To show American support for the people of West Berlin, Kennedy spoke in front of the wall. "There are many people in the world who really don't understand, or say they don't, what is the great issue between the free world and the communist world. Let them come to Berlin. There are some who say that communism is the wave of the future. Let them come to Berlin. Freedom has many difficulties and democracy is not perfect, but we have never had to put a wall up to keep our people in. All free men, wherever they may live, are citizens of Berlin, and therefore, as a free man, I take pride in the words, Ich bin ein Berliner. John F. Kennedy, June 26, 1963. Nonetheless, Kennedy was not willing to risk war to tear down the wall. Privately, he said, "A wall is a hell of a lot better than a war." The Cuban Missile Crisis, 13 days on the brink of nuclear war. A little more than a year after the Bay of Pigs fiasco, President Kennedy again focused his attention on Cuba. In October 1962, a U-2 spy plane flying over Cuba discovered that the Soviet Union was building missile launching sites on the island. From these sites, missiles carrying nuclear warheads could easily reach most major cities in the United States. To discuss ways to respond to this new threat, Kennedy brought together a group of his 12 most trusted advisors, called the Executive Committee for National Security, later known as EXCOM. Its members all agreed that the United States must halt construction of the Soviet missile sites. Failure to remove this threat would endanger American cities. It would also make the United States look weak to its European allies and to anti-Castro forces in Latin America. The EXCOM did not, however, agree on how to deal with the Cuban Missile Crisis. Some advisors urged the president to bomb the missile sites before they could be completed. Others suggested blockading Cuban ports to prevent ships from bringing missiles to the island. They called the blockade a quarantine because under international law, establishing a naval blockade is an act of war. Kennedy chose the quarantine plan. On October 22nd, Kennedy announced to the nation the discovery of the missile sites and his decision to quarantine the island. He warned that the United States would view any nuclear missile launch from Cuba as an attack on the United States by the Soviet Union. He also demanded the Soviets remove all offensive weapons from Cuba. For the next few days, Soviet ships continued to move toward Cuba. Fearing that the nation could be on the brink of nuclear war, Kennedy put the U.S. military on high alert. "I guess this is the week I earned my salary," he nervously joked. Then, on October 24th, Khrushchev ordered Soviet ships approaching Cuba to slow down or turn around. With great relief, Secretary of State Dean Rusk commented, "We are eyeball to eyeball, and I think the other fellow just blinked." A few days later, Khrushchev sent a note to Kennedy agreeing to remove Soviet missiles from Cuba. In exchange, he demanded that Kennedy end the Cuban blockade and promised not to invade Cuba. The next day, he sent a second note. In it, he proposed removing the Cuban missiles in exchange for the United States removing missiles it had placed in Turkey, which bordered the USSR. Kennedy had already decided to remove the U.S. missiles from Turkey because they were outdated. However, he did not want Khrushchev to think he was bowing to Soviet pressure. The EXCOM advised him to pretend he did not receive the second note. Publicly, Kennedy accepted the first deal. Privately, he sent Robert Kennedy to the Soviet embassy to agree to the second deal as well. On October 28th, Khrushchev agreed to remove all Soviet missiles from Cuba. About 3 months later, the United States removed its missiles from Turkey. Easing Cold War tensions. The Cuban Missile Crisis led Kennedy and his advisors to rethink the doctrine of massive retaliation adopted during the Eisenhower years. Instead, Kennedy began to talk about the need for a flexible response to local Cold War conflicts. When communists seemed on the verge of taking over Vietnam, a small country in Southeast Asia, the president tested this new approach. He sent money and military advisors to Vietnam to build non-communist forces in the country. By the end of 1962, more than 9,000 American military advisors were helping defend Vietnam from communism. The missile crisis also left Kennedy and Khrushchev frightened by how close they had come to nuclear war. As a result, both men began looking for ways to ease tensions between the superpowers. As a first step, the two leaders established a hotline between them. This line of communication would be kept open at all times so they could contact each other instantly during a crisis. The hotline still exists today and has been tested once an hour since 1963. Later the same year, the superpowers took another step in establishing more amicable relations. Along with Great Britain, they signed a test ban treaty. This agreement banned nuclear testing in the atmosphere, while allowing underground nuclear weapons tests to continue. By signing, the United States and Soviet Union showed that they could cooperate on important issues. Aiding development in foreign countries. President Kennedy was deeply concerned about the spread of communism to developing countries. Such countries are poorer and less industrialized than wealthy developed countries of North America. Western Europe, and parts of Asia. In a campaign speech in San Francisco, Kennedy spoke about his vision for helping the developing world. "There is not enough money in all America to relieve the misery of the underdeveloped world in a giant soup kitchen," he said, "but there is enough know-how to help those nations help themselves." To spread this know-how, Kennedy issued an executive order creating the Peace Corps. This new government agency sent thousands of men and women to developing nations to support local communities in such areas as education, farming, and healthcare. Before moving overseas, Peace Corps volunteers learned languages and skills they could use to build and help run schools and health clinics, teach farming methods, or plant crops. Kennedy also launched an aid program for Latin America called the Alliance for Progress. Its goal was to provide economic and technical aid to Latin American nations while encouraging democratic reforms. The program had little impact, however. Wealthy elites in Latin American nations resisted reform efforts. In time, most Alliance for Progress funds ended up in the pockets of anti-communist dictators for use in fighting communist rebels or others who opposed their rule.